My name is Antonia Salzano, and if you know that name, you likely know me as the mother of blessed Carlo Acutis, the young computer genius who stormed heaven wearing jeans and Nike sneakers. You know me from the interviews, where I smile serenely, speaking of God's will and the beauty of eternal life. You have seen me traveling the world, carrying the relics of my only son, comforting weeping mothers, and telling them that our children are in a better place. But until the early hours of October 10th, 2024, that smile was a masterful piece of architecture, a fortress built to hide a ruin. Beneath the public persona of the Saint's Mother, a title that feels heavier than any cross, I carried a secret so corrosive it nearly ate through my soul. I was furious with God. This was not the polite theological questioning we discuss in Bible study groups. This was a visceral, white-hot rage that I kept locked in the basement of my heart. I was angry at the Creator for taking my boy at 15, just when his life was blooming into something magnificent. I was angry at the doctors in the Monza hospital who, despite their degrees and machines, stood helpless as the fulminant leukemia ravaged my son's body in just 72 hours. I was angry at the universe for the cruel arithmetic that allowed drug addicts and criminals to live into old age, while my Carlo, who only ever wanted to bring people to Jesus, was extinguished like a candle in a gale. And perhaps most shamefully, I was angry at other mothers. I would see them in the supermarket scolding their teenage sons for messy rooms or bad grades, and I would have to physically restrain myself from screaming at them, telling them they had no idea what a luxury it was to have a living child to scold. I lived in this duality for nearly 2 decades. By day, I was Antonia the Strong, the pillar of faith. By night, specifically in the hollow silence of 3 a.m., I was a broken woman conducting a trial where God was the defendant and I was the prosecutor. I kept a mental ledger of everything Carlo had missed. By 2024, he would have been 33 years old, the same age as Christ when he was crucified. I tortured myself with alternate timelines. In one, he was a software engineer for the Vatican, revolutionizing how the church communicated with the youth. In another, he was married, perhaps to a nice girl from Milan, and I was holding my grandchildren. These fantasies were not comforting, they were agonizing. They were evidence of the theft I felt had been committed against me. The burden of being the mother of a blessed is that you are not allowed to grieve normally. When a regular mother loses a child, the world allows her to scream, to tear her clothes, to curse the heavens. But when your son is on the path to canonization, you are expected to be a living icon of acceptance. People would come to me with their tragedies, looking for a reflection of Carlo's holiness in my eyes, and I gave them what they needed. I poured out water from a well that was dry. I spoke of hope while my own heart was a landscape of scorched earth. I read thousands of letters from strangers claiming Carlo had interceded for them, curing cancers, fixing marriages, resolving debts. And while I publicly rejoiced, a dark, treacherous voice whispered in my ear, "If he can save them, why couldn't he save himself? If God loved him so much, why was his reward a death so early and so painful?" It was in this state of spiritual exhaustion that I found myself awake on that Thursday morning, October 10th, 2024. The date was significant. It was the anniversary of his beatification in Assisi, a day where my phone would ring non-stop with congratulations and prayer requests. The anticipation of the day made my insomnia worse. I had given up on sleep around 2:30 a.m. and had wandered down to the kitchen of our home. The house was silent, that heavy, pressurized silence that only exists in the deep night. I made tea that I didn't intend to drink and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Carlo used to eat his breakfast, with that voracious teenage appetite, crumbs falling onto his school books. I looked at the empty chair across from me. It was a modern chair, nothing special, but in my mind, it was still his. The digital clock on the oven flickered to 3:17 a.m. This was the exact time I used to wake up when he was an infant to feed him, and later the time I would sometimes wake him to pray or to get ready for an early trip. My mind began its familiar poisonous loop. I looked at the ceiling and whispered, not a prayer, but an accusation. I asked God why he required such a sacrifice. I asked why my motherhood had to be a martyrdom. I felt the tears coming, hot and stinging, the kind that leave you with a migraine for days. I closed my eyes, burying my face in my hands, surrendering to the wave of bitterness that I had managed to keep hidden from my husband Andrea and my spiritual director. Then the air in the room changed. It is difficult to explain to someone who has not experienced it. It wasn't a gust of wind or a drop in temperature. It was a shift in density, a sudden fullness in the empty space. The silence, which had been oppressive, suddenly became expectant, vibrant. Then came the smell. It was not the smell of incense or lilies that people often associate with apparitions. It was the smell of ozone, like the air after a thunderstorm, mixed with a faint, distinct scent of the specific cologne Carlo used to wear as a teenager, a cheap, citrusy brand he bought with his own allowance. My heart hammered against my ribs, not out of fear, but out of a shock that bypassed my brain and went straight to my blood. I slowly lowered my hands from my face. I was afraid to open my eyes, afraid that my desperate mind was finally cracking under the strain of 18 years of suppressed grief. But I had to look. I opened them. He was there. Carlo was sitting in his chair across the table. He wasn't glowing with an ethereal light, nor was he transparent like a ghost in a movie. He looked solid, real, three-dimensional. He was wearing his favorite red polo shirt with the collar slightly turned up, and his curly hair was as unruly as it had been the day he died. He looked exactly 15, frozen in that awkward, beautiful bridge between boyhood and manhood. His hands were resting on the table, and he was looking at me with an expression I knew well. It was the look he used to give me when he had figured out a complex computer code and was waiting for me to understand it. It was a look of patience, amusement, and infinite love. "Ciao, Mama," he said. His voice was the sound that broke me. It wasn't an echo or a whisper in my head. It was acoustic, vibrating the air in the kitchen. It was the voice that had called me for dinner, the voice that had argued about curfew, the voice that had prayed the rosary with a speed that always made me laugh. Hearing it again, after 18 years of silence, felt like oxygen rushing into a room where I had been slowly suffocating. "Carlo," I choked out. My body was trembling so violently that the teacup rattled in its saucer. "Is it? Are you?" "I am here," he said, his smile widening. That smile. It was the smile that had charmed nurses, priests, and beggars alike. But there was a gravity to it now, a depth that hadn't been there in life. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, just as I had told him 1,000 times not to do. "I know you are tired, Mama," he said softly. "I know about the anger. The shame that washed over me was instant and paralyzing. I wanted to deny it, to put on the mask of the pious mother, to quote scripture. But looking into his eyes that seemed to hold the reflection of a light I couldn't see, I knew that lies were impossible here. He saw everything. He saw the resentment I harbored toward the doctors. He saw the envy I felt toward my friends. He saw the fist I shook at heaven when the doors were locked. "I'm so sorry, Carlo," I sobbed, the dam finally breaking. "I tried to be good. I tried to accept it, but it hurts so much. It's so unfair. Why did you have to go? Why couldn't God take me instead? I'm the old one. You had everything ahead of you." Carlo reached across the table. I flinched, expecting his hand to pass through mine, but when his fingers touched my hand, I felt a warmth, a distinct physical warmth that spread from my fingertips up my arm, calming the tremors. "Mama, listen to me," he said, his tone shifting from casual to urgent. You have been carrying a stone in your heart, thinking it is a tribute to me. But it is not a tribute. It is an anchor. You think that forgiving the reality of my death means you stop loving me. You think that if you let go of the anger, you are betraying the injustice of what happened. But I came tonight because the Lord wants you to be free. He does not want a martyr of resentment. He wants a mother of joy. He paused, squeezing my hand. You need to understand what forgiveness really is, Mama. It is not just saying, it is okay. It is not pretending the pain didn't happen. True forgiveness is a supernatural act. It is powerful technology, more complex than any computer program I ever wrote. When you truly forgive, you do not just liberate the ones who hurt you, you literally change the past. I stared at him, confused, wiping the tears from my cheeks with my free hand. Change the past? Carlo, that's impossible. The past is stone. You died. Nothing can change that. He shook his head, his eyes dancing with that intellectual excitement he always had when explaining a new concept. The facts do not change, Mama. The dates, the events, the medical charts, those remain. But the past is not just facts. The past is your experience of those facts. It is the emotional memory you carry. Right now, your past is a wound that never heals because the infection of anger keeps it open. Every memory of us is tainted by the ending. You look at photos of my first communion and you don't feel the joy of that day. You feel the pain of the funeral. The anger has rewritten our history into a tragedy. He sat back, releasing my hand but holding my gaze. But when you forgive deeply, when you forgive God, the doctors, the world, and your self-love rushes backward through time. It heals the memories. It washes the bitterness out of the timeline. You will still miss me, yes, but the missing will stop feeling like a robbery and start feeling like a gift. You will look back at our 15 years and see them not as a life cut short, but as a masterpiece completed. That is how you change the past. You change the nature of the memory from trauma to grace. I sat there processing his words. They made sense intellectually, but emotionally the wall was still there. The hurt was too deep, too old. But how, Carlo? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. How do I forgive God? It feels like blasphemy even to say I need to forgive him, but I do. I feel like he betrayed our family. We served him. We loved him. And he crushed us. Carlo's expression softened into infinite compassion. Mama, God is not offended by your hurt. He's not a tyrant who demands you smile while you bleed. He is a father who knows what it is to lose a son. But you must understand, he didn't take me to punish you. He didn't take me because he didn't care. He promoted me. He brought me to the command center. He gestured vaguely upwards, a playful smirk returning to his lips. I am busier now than I ever was on earth, Mama. I am working on projects you cannot imagine, and I can love you better from there than I ever could from here. But your anger, it builds a wall. It's like static on the line. I am shouting, I love you and I am happy, but all you hear is the static of why me, and it's not fair. To hear me, truly hear me, you have to tune out the static. You have to forgive. He stood up then and walked over to the window where the first hint of pre-dawn gray was touching the sky. He looked out at the street where he used to ride his bicycle. There are 4 keys, Mama, he said, without turning around. 4 people you must forgive to break the chain. He turned back to face me, holding up 4 fingers. First, God. You must forgive him for his timing, which is not your timing. You must trust that his view of the tapestry is better than your view of the loose threads. Second, the doctors. They were men, Mama, not angels. They fought for me. They cried when I died. You must release them from the debt of being saviors. Only Jesus is the savior. He lowered 2 fingers. Third, the other mothers. The ones you envy. They are not thieves. Their joy does not steal from yours. When you see them, instead of feeling poison, you must force yourself to bless them. It will feel fake at first. Do it anyway. The feeling will follow the action. He lowered the third finger, leaving only one. He walked back to the table and leaned down, his face inches from mine. And fourth, and most importantly, Antonia. You must forgive Antonia. You must forgive yourself for not being able to save me. You must forgive yourself for the anger you felt. You must forgive yourself for being human. You are not a bad mother because you grieved. You are a great mother who loved fiercely. But now that love must evolve. I was weeping openly now, but the tears felt different. They felt cleansing, like rain washing away grime. What do? I asked. Tell me what to do, Carlo. I'll do anything. He smiled, and for a moment he looked like the little boy who used to ask for an extra scoop of gelato. It's a boot camp, Mama. Spiritual boot camp. For the next 30 days, starting today, I want you to meet me here at 6:15 a.m., the time I used to go to Mass. Sit in this chair, and I want you to say 4 sentences out loud, not in your head, out loud. Your ears need to hear your voice, changing your reality. He told me the sentences, simple words, but heavy with power. I forgive God for calling Carlo home early. I forgive the doctors for their human limitations. I forgive other mothers for their blessings. I forgive myself for my anger and my grief. Say them until you mean them, he instructed. At first they will taste like ash in your mouth. You will feel like a liar. Keep saying them. By the second week, they will become easier. By the third week, they will become prayers. By the fourth week, they will become the truth. He began to fade then, not dissolving into mist, but simply becoming less there, as if he were stepping back into a room I couldn't perceive. And Mama, his voice came, now slightly more distant, but still clear. When you finish this, you won't stop missing me. I don't want you to stop missing me. But you will find that you can remember my laugh without remembering the hospital room. You will find that you can speak my name without your throat closing up. You will find peace. That is my promise. Carlo, I called out, reaching for him. I love you, Mama. Only the Eucharist is the highway to heaven. But forgiveness is the key that starts the engine. And then he was gone. The kitchen was just a kitchen again. The smell of ozone and citrus lingered for another minute, then faded into the smell of cold coffee and old wood. The clock read 3:42 a.m. 25 minutes had passed, but it felt like a lifetime. I sat there in the silence, my hand still warm where he had touched it. For the first time in 18 years, the house didn't feel empty. It felt occupied by a promise. I didn't go back to sleep. I sat in that chair, watching the light change in the window, waiting for 6:15 a.m. I was terrified. I was exhausted, but I was also ready. When the numbers on the clock finally aligned, I cleared my throat. My voice was raspy, weak, trembling with the weight of almost 2 decades of resistance. I forgive God for calling Carlo home early, I whispered. It felt like lifting a boulder. My stomach clenched in rebellion. No, I don't, a part of me screamed. I hate it. I took a breath and said it again, louder. I forgive God for calling Carlo home early. Then the next. I forgive the doctors for their human limitations. I visualized the face of the chief oncologist, a man I had mentally cursed 1,000 times. I tried to see him as Carlo described, just a man, tired, defeated, crying in the hallway. I forgive other mothers for their blessings. This was the hardest. I thought of my neighbor, whose son was a drug addict but alive. I forced the words out. I forgive myself for my anger and my grief. I sat there for an hour repeating the loop. It was grueling work, more exhausting than physical labor. It felt like I was performing surgery on my own soul without anesthesia. But as the sun fully rose, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the kitchen, I realized something. I had survived the first day, and for the briefest of seconds, amidst the pain, I felt a tiny, microscopic spark of something that wasn't anger. It wasn't quite joy yet, but it was the absence of hate. This is the story of those 30 days. It is the story of how a mother learned that the only way to hold on to her son was to let go of her pain. If you are listening to this, and you are carrying a secret anger against heaven, against a person, or against yourself, I ask you to stay with me. Because what Carlo taught me is not just for mothers of saints. It is for anyone who has ever felt that life cheated them. It is for anyone who is stuck in the past, wishing they could change the ending. You can change the ending, not of the event, but of the story you live in. The journey wasn't a straight line. There were mornings I sat in that chair and screamed the words in fury rather than whispered them in peace. There were days I wanted to quit, thinking I was hallucinating, thinking I was just a crazy old woman talking to an empty room. But then, small things began to happen, strange coincidences. A song on the radio, a bird on the windowsill, and slowly the texture of my memories began to alter, just as he had predicted. Let me tell you about the second week, because that is when the real battle began. The novelty of the supernatural visit had worn off, and I was left with the grinding reality of the discipline. Forgiveness is not a feeling, it is a muscle, and mine was atrophied. On day 8, I woke up with a headache that felt like a band of steel around my skull. It was raining, a gray, miserable Milanese rain that soaked into your bones. I didn't want to go to the kitchen. I wanted to stay in bed and pull the covers over my head. I wanted to wallow. The voice of the victim was loud that morning. Why should I forgive? It hissed. I am the one who lost everything. God should be asking me for forgiveness. I almost didn't go down. But then I remembered the warmth of Carlo's hand. It was a physical sensation I could still recall, a tactile memory that anchored me to reality. I dragged myself downstairs. I sat in the chair. I forgive God. I started, but the words stuck. I couldn't say it. The image of Carlo in the hospital bed, tubes running in and out of his bruised arms, flashed in my mind. The rage flared up, hot and fresh. How could I forgive the author of that scene? I sat in silence for 10 minutes, fighting with myself. Then I heard a sound. It was the distinct ping of a computer booting up. I froze. Carlo's old computer was in his room upstairs, untouched, unplugged for years. It was a relic, a shrine. I hadn't turned it on since 2006. I walked up the stairs, my heart pounding. The door to his room was ajar. I pushed it open. The computer was dark. Of course it was. It was unplugged. I let out a breath, chiding myself for my imagination. But as I turned to leave, my eye caught something on his desk. It was a sticky note, yellow and curled with age, stuck to the side of his monitor. I had seen it 1,000 times, but I had never really read it, not with my heart. It was in his handwriting, that scrawling, hurried script of a boy whose mind moved faster than his hand. It was a quote he loved, not from a saint, but something he had written himself. Sadness is looking at ourselves. Happiness is looking towards God. I peeled the note off the monitor. The paper was brittle. Sadness is looking at ourselves. That was what I had been doing for 18 years. I had been staring in the mirror of my own loss, obsessed with my own pain, my own deprivation. I was worshipping my grief instead of worshipping God. The anger wasn't protecting Carlo, it was protecting my ego. I felt a sudden, crushing wave of humility. I went back down to the kitchen. I sat in the chair, and this time, I didn't just say the words. I threw them out like a drowning woman throwing a rope. I forgive God. And for the first time, I felt the knot in my chest loosen, just a fraction. But it was enough. By the 15th day, the halfway point, the process began to affect my waking life. I was at the grocery store, standing in line behind a young mother. Her son, about 4 years old, was throwing a tantrum. He was screaming, kicking, demanding candy. The mother looked exhausted, her hair messy, her eyes pleading for patience. Normally, this scene would have triggered my envy. Look at her, I would have thought. She doesn't appreciate him. She wishes he would be quiet. I would give anything to hear my son scream if it meant he was alive. But that day, as the old thought rose up, the new pathway I had been carving every morning at 6:15 a.m. kicked in. The sentence echoed in my mind. I forgive other mothers for their blessings. Instead of glaring, I felt a sudden surge of compassion. I saw her not as a rival, but as a sister in the trenches. I stepped forward. "He has strong lungs," I said to her, smiling. "That means he has a strong heart. You're doing a good job, Mama." The woman looked at me, startled, and then her face crumpled in relief. "Thank you," she whispered. "I feel like I'm failing today." "You're not failing," I said, and I realized I was speaking to myself as much as to her. "You're just loving him through the noise." I walked out of that store feeling lighter than air. I realized that by forgiving her for having what I didn't, I had freed myself to connect with her. My envy had been a cage. Forgiveness was the key. But the hardest day was day 23. That was the day I had to confront the doctors. I had an appointment for my own checkup at the same hospital where Carlo died. I hadn't been back there in years. I usually went to a private clinic across town to avoid the memories. But my specialist had moved to the San Gerardo, and I had no choice. Walking through those glass doors was like walking into a nightmare. The smell of antiseptic triggered a panic attack. I could see the ghost of my younger self running through the lobby, desperate, praying. I got into the elevator, and my hand shook as I pressed the button. As I sat in the waiting room, I saw a doctor walking past. He wasn't one of Carlo's doctors. He was too young, but he wore the same white coat, the same stethoscope, the symbol of my disappointment. The anger rose up, choking me. "Useless," the voice hissed. "They know nothing. They play God, but they can't fix anything." I closed my eyes. I was in public, surrounded by people, but I transported myself back to my kitchen chair. I forgive the doctors for their human limitations. I repeated it mentally over and over, syncing it with my breath. They are men, not angels. They are men, not angels. Then I opened my eyes and looked at the young doctor again. I really looked at him. I saw the dark circles under his eyes. I saw the slump in his shoulders. I saw the way he rubbed his forehead, as if he had a headache that wouldn't go away. I realized he was probably carrying the weight of a patient he couldn't save that morning. He wasn't an arrogant god. He was a soldier in a losing war against death. A profound sadness for him washed over me. I realized that while I lost one son, these men and women lose sons and daughters every week. They carry a graveyard in their hearts, and they have to keep working. "I forgive you," I whispered under my breath. And in that moment, the hospital stopped looking like a torture chamber and started looking like a place of mercy, however imperfect. The final breakthrough happened on the 30th day, November 9th. I woke up before the alarm. I felt a strange sense of excitement, like it was a holiday. I went to the kitchen. I sat in the chair. I said the words. But this time, they weren't instructions. They were statements of fact. I forgive God for calling Carlo home early. I felt peace. I felt that God's plan was a mystery, but a loving one. I forgive the doctors for their human limitations. I felt gratitude that they had tried. I forgive other mothers for their blessings. I felt joy for the life continuing around me. I forgive myself for my anger and my grief. When I said the last one, I waited for the usual pang of guilt. It didn't come. Instead, a memory flooded my mind. It was Carlo, sitting on the floor of our living room when he was 10, playing with his PlayStation. He looked up at me and laughed, a full belly laugh, because he had just beaten a level. For 18 years, whenever I remembered that moment, it was followed by the thought, he will never play again. The joy was immediately decapitated by the loss. But this time, I saw him laughing and I just smiled. I felt the warmth of his happiness. I stayed in the memory, enjoying his victory. The thought of his death was there, on the periphery, but it didn't attack the memory. It didn't turn the gold into lead. I started to cry, but they were tears of liberation. Carlo was right. I had changed the past. I had reclaimed the joy of my son from the jaws of my resentment. I stood up and went to the window. The sun was coming up, painting the sky in pink and gold. I felt Carlo's presence again, not as a vision in the room, but as a warmth in my heart. Brava, Mama, I heard in my soul. Now you are ready to really live. Today, 6 months later, I am a different woman. I still travel. I still speak about Carlo. But the hollow feeling is gone. When I tell mothers that God is good, I'm not reciting a script. I am testifying to a reality I have fought for. I have learned that forgiveness is the only bridge that can carry the weight of grief without collapsing. If you are listening to this, and you feel the static in your line to heaven, check your heart for anger. Check for the unforgivable things you are holding on to. You might think your anger is your connection to the person you lost, but it is not. It is the wall between you and them. Break the wall. Say the words. Change the past. My son Carlo, the computer geek who loved the Eucharist, hacked my grief. He showed me the code to rewrite the program of pain. And if he were here right now, sitting in this chair, he would tell you the same thing he told me that night, with that mischievous, holy smile. Sadness is looking at ourselves. Happiness is looking towards God. And forgiveness. Forgiveness is how we turn our heads. The true test of any boot camp, spiritual or physical, is not how you perform on the training ground, but how you survive the battlefield. My battlefield arrived 3 weeks after I completed the 30 days, in the form of a letter from the Vatican. It was the official notification regarding the final consistory for Carlo's canonization. The date was set. My son was to be declared a saint of the Universal Church. In the years before, such news would have triggered a complex panic within Mia, frantic worry about travel logistics, interviews, and the crushing pressure to perform the role of the Holy Mother while feeling like a fraud. But as I held the heavy, cream-colored stationery in my hands, I felt a quiet, steady pulse of joy. It was not the manic, desperate joy of someone trying to prove a point, but the calm satisfaction of a mother whose child has just graduated. However, the real climax of my journey did not happen in the marble halls of the Vatican. It happened in a small, sterile corridor of the San Gerardo Hospital in Monza, where I had been asked to return, not as a patient, but to bless a new pediatric wing named in Carlo's honor. I walked into the hospital on a Tuesday afternoon. The scent of disinfectant, once a trigger for nausea and rage, now just smelled clean. I moved through the crowd of administrators and journalists, smiling, shaking hands, feeling the static in my soul remain silent. I was doing well. I was holding on to the peace Carlo had promised. Then I saw him. Standing near the back of the crowd, looking older and far more fragile than I remembered, was Dr. Claudio. He had been the lead specialist during those final horrific 72 hours in 2006. He was the man who had to tell me that the leukemia was M3, the most aggressive type. He was the man I had secretly blamed for 18 years, the man whose face had been the target of my midnight trials. He wasn't supposed to be there. He had retired years ago. But he had come, perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of guilt. As our eyes locked across the room, I saw him flinch. He looked like a man bracing for a blow. In his eyes, I saw the reflection of my own past anger. He expected the saint's mother to offer a polite, icy nod, the kind that cuts deeper than a knife. The old Antonia would have turned away. The old Antonia would have hidden behind a wall of entourage. But the new Antonia, the one who had spent 30 mornings whispering forgiveness into the empty air of her kitchen, felt a sudden physical pull. It was the same magnetic warmth I had felt when Carlo touched my hand. I excused myself from the hospital director and walked straight toward Dr. Claudio. The room seemed to go quiet, or perhaps it was just my own hearing narrowing down to a single point. As I reached him, he straightened up, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "Signora Salzano," he said, his voice raspy. I didn't want to intrude. I just wanted to see." "Doctor Claudio," I said. "I still think of him," he blurted out, the professional mask slipping entirely. "I still wake up thinking about the speed of it. We should have done more. The protocols, we were too slow. I am so sorry, Antonia. I failed him." There it was. The confession I had craved for nearly 2 decades. The admission of guilt that I thought would finally balance the scales. He was handing me his sword, offering his neck for the strike. But as I looked at this broken man, I realized that taking his guilt would not bring Carlo back. It would only chain me to the hospital bed again. I remembered Carlo's voice in the kitchen. They were men, Mama, not angels. I reached out and took both of his hands in mine. They were cold, just as mine used to be. "You didn't fail him, Claudio," I said, my voice steady and loud enough for him to hear over his own shame. "You walked him to the door. That was your job. You walked him to the threshold and Jesus opened it. You didn't lose the battle. You just couldn't stop the victory." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open, tears pooling in his eyes. "But the pain is gone," I told him, and I squeezed his hands. "I have forgiven the leukemia. I have forgiven the timing. And Claudio, I have forgiven you. Please, you must forgive yourself. Carlo is not angry with you. He is praying for you." The doctor broke. He didn't weep loudly. He just slumped forward, his forehead resting on our joined hands, shaking with the release of a burden he had carried since 2006. I held him there, in the middle of the hospital corridor, ignoring the cameras and the dignitaries. For the first time, I wasn't acting. I wasn't the icon. I was just a mother, using the surplus of love my son had given me to heal a wound in someone else. In that moment, the transaction was complete. The anger that had eaten at my soul was not just suppressed. It was transmuted. It had become fuel for mercy. The canonization ceremony months later was a blur of gold and white, of choirs that sounded like the ocean, and millions of people chanting my son's name. But as I sat in St. Peter's Square, watching the tapestry of Carlo being unfurled from the Loggia Carlo in his jeans, his backpack, his smile, I didn't look up at the image. I looked down at my hands. They were empty. The ledger I had kept against God, the list of stolen years and missed grandchildren was gone. I was no longer the prosecutor in the trial against the Almighty. I was a witness to His strange, severe, and beautiful mercy. I went home to Assisi a week later. The house was quiet, but it was a peaceful silence, not a lonely one. I walked into the kitchen at 6:15 a.m., out of habit. The chair opposite me was empty. There was no smell of ozone, no sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. Carlo did not appear, and I realized I didn't need him to. I sat down and closed my eyes. "Thank you," I whispered into the morning light. I didn't say, "I forgive." I had moved past the boot camp. I had graduated from the school of grief. "Thank you for the 15 years," I said. "Thank you for the loan of him. Thank you for trusting me to give him back." I stood up, made a coffee, and walked to the window. Outside, a group of teenagers was walking up the hill toward the basilica, laughing, checking their phones, wearing sneakers just like his. They were alive, vibrant, and messy. For the first time in 18 years, I didn't envy their mothers. I blessed them. "Go," I whispered to the glass. "Go and live. And if you need help with the Wi-Fi code to heaven, ask my son. He knows the way." My name is Antonia Salzano. I am the mother of Saint Carlo Acutis. But more importantly, I am Antonia, a woman who learned that while death can end a life, it cannot end a relationship, not if you are brave enough to lay down your anger and pick up your love. The computer is off, the screen is dark, but the connection is infinite. The morning of the canonization did not begin with a choir of angels, but with the frantic, earthly buzzing of my phone and the sharp smell of espresso in a hotel room overlooking the Vatican. Rome was heaving. It felt as though the entire city was straining against its ancient walls, swollen with pilgrims who had traveled from Brazil, the Philippines, Poland, and the United States. They wore T-shirts printed with my son's face, the face I used to scrub with a washcloth, and they waved flags that snapped in the crisp October wind. The car ride to St. Peter's Square was a slow crawl through a sea of humanity. Through the tinted glass, I watched them. Young men with backpacks, nuns in habits of every color, families pushing strollers over the cobblestones. They were chanting his name. "Carlo! Carlo! Carlo!" It was a rhythm that used to belong to our kitchen, a name called out to signal dinner or homework. Now, it was a liturgical chant, a roar that belonged to the world. For a fleeting second, the old constriction tightened in my chest. The possessive mother in me wanted to roll down the window and scream, "He is mine! You do not know him! You only know the icon, not the boy who left wet towels on the floor!" But the thought was weak, a ghost of the old anger that had no foothold left in my renovated heart. I touched the small crucifix around my neck, took a breath, and whispered the words that had become my armor. I forgive other mothers for their blessings. I bless them for their joy. When we finally took our seats in the Sagrato, the area reserved for dignitaries and family at the foot of the basilica steps, the scale of it hit me. The colonnade of Bernini seemed to hug a crowd that stretched back to the Tiber. And there, hanging from the central loggia of St. Peter's Basilica, was the tapestry. It was colossal. It was the photo taken in Assisi, the one where he looked so relaxed, so modern, wearing his red polo and jeans, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Seeing my son's face, 3 stories tall, suspended against the travertine stone of the most sacred building in Christendom, was surreal. It was a collision of the domestic and the divine that made my head spin. The Mass began. The Sistine choir's voices rose like smoke, intertwining with the wind. I sat between my husband, Andrea, and my 2 younger children, born after Carlo's death. I held Andrea's hand. His palm was sweating. We were 2 ordinary people caught in a celestial storm. Then came the moment. The prefect of the dicastery for the causes of saints approached the Pope. The formula was read in Latin, ancient words that had canonized martyrs and mystics for centuries. Beatum Carolum Acutis Sanctum esse decernimus et definimus. We declare and define Blessed Carlo Acutis to be a saint. The silence that followed the pronouncement lasted only a heartbeat, but in that heartbeat, the universe seemed to tilt. The final barrier was removed. He was no longer just the boy I mourned, nor the blessed I prayed to. He was a saint of the universal church. The crowd erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was a thunderclap of joy. It was a physical wave of sound that washed over us, vibrating in the stone beneath my feet. I looked up at the tapestry. The wind caught the fabric, making Carlo's image ripple slightly, animating his smile. In that deafening roar, I closed my eyes and went inward to the quiet kitchen of my soul. I looked for the grief. I looked for the robbery I had felt for 18 years. I looked for the accusation that God had taken him too soon. I found nothing. The basement of my heart was empty of rage. It had been swept clean. In its place was a profound crystalline clarity. I realized then that the miracle wasn't just that Carlo was in heaven. The miracle was that I was still on earth, whole. I had survived the amputation of my heart, and by the grace of God and the hard work of forgiveness, the wound had not just healed, it had become a womb for a new kind of love. I wasn't losing him to the millions of people cheering his name. I was expanding to include them. I looked at the tapestry again and smiled, tears streaming down my face, not hot tears of bitterness, but cool tears of release. Okay, Carlo, I thought, projecting the words toward the giant image. You win. You hacked the system. You are everyone's brother now. The weeks following the canonization were a whirlwind of interviews, handshakes, and flashes, but eventually the tide receded. The world turned its attention to new headlines, and I was allowed to return to Assisi. It was a Tuesday in November when I finally found myself alone in the house. The silence was different now. It wasn't the heavy, pressurized silence of the nights when I used to prosecute God. It was a light, airy silence, filled with the dust motes of a late autumn afternoon. I walked into the kitchen. It was 3 p.m., not 3 a.m., but the light hit the table in a way that reminded me of that night. I made a cup of tea and sat in my chair. I looked at the empty chair across from me. For a moment I allowed myself the luxury of imagination. I pictured him sitting there, 33 years old, perhaps with a receding hairline, perhaps tired from a job in IT, perhaps worrying about a mortgage. I played the what-if game one last time. But the image wouldn't hold. It dissolved into the reality of who he actually was, a force of nature, a streak of light that had burned too bright to stay contained in a long life. I realized I didn't want the alternate timeline anymore. I didn't want the version of history where I kept him for myself, but the world lost a saint. The trade-off was agonizing, yes, but it was also magnificent. I took a sip of tea. The liquid was warm, grounding. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from a woman in Brazil, a stranger. Signora Antonia, it read. My son has leukemia. I was angry at God for months. Then I heard your story about the boot camp of forgiveness. Today, I forgave the doctors. I feel like I can breathe again. Thank you. I stared at the screen. The ripple effect. The code Carlo had written was still executing, running on the hardware of human hearts thousands of miles away. I set the phone down and looked out the window toward the Basilica of St. Francis, where my son's body lay in its glass tomb, wearing his jeans and Nikes, waiting for the resurrection. You're still working, aren't you? I said aloud to the empty room. I felt no ghostly touch, no smell of ozone, just the warmth of the sun on my hands and the steady rhythm of my own heart. Good, I whispered. Keep working. I'll handle things down here. I stood up, rinsed my cup in the sink and dried my hands. I had a meeting with a group of pilgrims at 4 o'clock, and I needed to change. There was work to be done, comfort to be given, and joy to be shared. I was Antonia Salzano, the mother of a saint, and for the first time in 18 years, I was entirely, beautifully free. I walked out of the kitchen and didn't look back at the empty chair. I didn't need to. I carried him with me,